So today we are going to be covering NPM, the Node Package Manager, and we're going to learn what it is, a little bit about what Node.js is and how they relate, how to create a new NPM project, and what happens when we do, and how to manage installing dependencies. And I know you all have gone a bit of a preview with this with the full stack week, but we're going to dig in deeper. Especially importing in JavaScript has a little bit of funkiness here and there. And then we're also going to dig into some modern JavaScript language features and look more at Axios, which is similar to Fetch, a library for making HTTP requests. And then what we're going to look at in part 2 is we are going to get more into React. And what we're going to be seeing here is what is Vite and why do we use it? What is React? Creating a React project with Vite. We're going to explore the project structure. And we're going to just dive into a whole bunch of stuff with project structure. And then we're going to create a simple React guessing game. And today is really the introduction, and the focus is on project structure. And tomorrow we're going to get deeper and deeper into React.js. So before I dive into the NPM stuff, can someone maybe tell me just what is Node? What is Node.js?
It's a way to run the JavaScript in the terminal instead of the browser.
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly what it is. Someone literally said, hey, like the JavaScript engine in the browser, specifically in Chrome, has gotten pretty darn good. And Chrome's JavaScript engine is called V8, is in a V8 engine. And I don't know, in the early 2000s, someone thought, hey, what if I take that JavaScript engine and wrap it in some C code so we can use it like in a Linux environment and on the command line to run JavaScript outside the browser. And that's Node.js. And for various reasons, JavaScript is nice for certain things server side. And can someone maybe tell me what NPM is?
The Node package manager. It's just like other package managers. You can install different things that you need. Kind of like, I think it's Node's version of pip, maybe like Python.
Exactly. NPM is very much Node's version of pip. And it's really normal for each programming language to have, there's usually one popular package manager. And Axios indeed stands, or I'm so sorry, NPM indeed stands for Node Package Manager. And you can go here and you can look at the different packages, and we could then look at its GitHub repo, and you can see how many weekly downloads it has and all sorts of nice information. So the same way that we've been using pip to install our Python dependencies, we're going to be using NPM to install our JavaScript dependencies. Instead of modules, they're called packages, though modules kind of show up as well. And excuse me. And we'll see, though, NPM does a couple more things for us as well. Oh, excuse me. So let's go ahead and get started checking out NPM. And so first, I'm just going to do npm -v to see what version of NPM I have running. There's probably a newer one out than this one, but version 10.2.4 is totally fine. Let's go ahead and make a new project with NPM. And let's make a to-do list project. So I'm going to create a directory that's going to hold my to-do list project. And let's go ahead and navigate into that. And the command I use to start a new NPM project, and the value of walking through this stuff with NPM is, as we'll see as we get into React, like project structure and all of this tooling becomes a big deal. So this is sort of laying out the space that we'll be working in over the next week or so. To create a new project, I just run npm init. And it has this nice command line utility that walks me through creating a new npm project. So it will give me all these different prompts. If I wanted to name the package something different than the default here, which is to-do list, I could put whatever I wanted to name it right there. If I just want to use the default value, I can just hit enter. And to be honest, it's totally fine to hit enter for all of these things. The entry point, as we'll learn, is sort of the same idea like with the main method or runner py. It's the file that npm will look to run first. And as you can see, there's all these different things. And once we get through this, we can see what this does. And I can just hit enter for all of these. And what really all that npm init does is create a file named package.json, which is a JSON file that holds the configuration for this npm project. So if I look here in the to-do list, now this package.json file has been created. And this is it's in the JSON format that we're starting to get more used to. And here are all of these different properties. You can, I apologize that I'm switching. It's mostly in VS Code for this part. When we get into where we're using the browser more, I'll switch to split screen. If you want to, the Node.js and NPM docs have extremely comprehensive documentation around every part of the package.json. This can be interesting to look at, but isn't critical. So what do we have here? We have our name, we have the version, and very briefly, Node.js and NPM use what's called semantic versioning, where this first number is the major version number. This is, I believe, the minor version number, and this is called the patch. And the idea is if I make a huge change where suddenly an old version of this program won't work, that's a major version change. Anything that's not a major version should be non-breaking and safe. We have our description. We at various times, NPM will maybe look to what the main file is. And then we have this scripts attribute that itself is a JSON object that has a property named test. And we can see, hey, this looks like a command line command, right? Echo is the command line version of print. But it's not really running anything right now. We could add ourselves as the author if I want. And the license is for, especially for like an open source package, there are different licenses that you can use to specify like what people can or cannot do with it. And we don't have to really worry about that. And actually, I'm not that familiar with the ISC license. If someone wants to find a link for that and throw that in the chat, that would be awesome. But so this is what the npm init command does for us. And that's really about it. No, it hasn't created index.js or anything like that. It really just made the package.json. So let's talk a little bit about the scripts, because this is where it starts to get a little interesting. I do want to very quickly demo one thing, which is, let me move back and let's make it just another to-do list and close this out for a minute. So when you're making a new NPM project, if you know you just want to use all the defaults, you can do npm init space -y. And that created a package JSON just with all default values. So that's just a nice thing to know to save yourself a little time. So let's talk about NPM scripts briefly. An NPM script is a command, and you can use NPM on the command line to execute that script. If I run NPM test, we see this name of my package and the version and the NPM script that's being run, and then it runs the actual command itself, which is printing out this message. A couple scripts have special names, such as test and start, which I'll show you in a moment. If I wanted to create my own script, I need to do npm run test. If I just do npm foo, we get an unknown command, and it prompts me npm run foo. And because certain of these scripts are so common, npm just lets you do the shortcut. And another one that's really common that there's a shortcut for is start. But to do that, let's go ahead and make this file index.js. And just put a hello world message in it. Now, how can I run index.js now that I've created it? How can I run my program? Not a trick question. There's a couple of valid answers here.
Node index.
Yeah, thank you. And Michael, I see you just threw that in the chat. I can do node index.js, and that works great. What we're going to see as our JavaScript projects with NPM get bigger is that NPM wants to do certain things when we run our code, and also for importing and exporting, using NPM to run stuff helps the importing and exporting happen correctly. So a very common script, and in fact, this is one of the magic words where you don't need to use run, is start. And exactly like you were saying, Michael, we're going to say, hey, NPM, this start script, just run node with index.js. And now I can do npm start. If I wanted to, I can do npm run start. But since npm start is the kind of thing we'll be doing all the time, npm has just made it easier where you don't have to type run. And I do recommend getting in the habit of making Vite will actually create a start script for us with React. But most of the time as we get into React, you'll be using npm start or other npm script commands to actually run your program. You can always use Node to run an individual JavaScript file if you want to see some console logs or stuff like that. But you'll want to be getting comfortable with running npm scripts. So let's move on to one of the most useful parts of a package manager, which is installing stuff. And I was looking a little early at this library Axios that lets us make HTTP requests like fetch with promises or async and await, but Axios gives us a bit more features. So that's what we're going to be using a lot, really entirely for React. Does anyone know how I can install Axios using NPM?
NPM install Axios.
Yeah, exactly. And as always with these command line programs, you can do npm space -- help. And then in fact, if I wanted to, I could do npm install space -- help. And it gives me even more information. And there's all these different options, right? So our command line program npm has a bunch of different commands that themselves have, flags and subcommands and things like that. So to install a package with npm, and excuse me, that is my little timer going off. To install a package with npm, we do npm install. And I want to add save, and we'll see why in a moment, Axios. So a bunch of things just happened here. First off, look what happened to the package.json. NPM actually modified my package.json for me. It added a JSON object named dependencies. And here we have Axios. And here we have the version of Axios, right? NPM went to the npmjs.com server and was like, hey, give me the most recent version of Axios. A couple other things happened. This file package-lock.json was created. A directory named node modules was created. And the reason we need to do --save, by the way, is because it adds Axios to the dependencies object here in package.json. And if you all remember like requirements.txt with pip, we always want every dependency we install to be in dependencies in package.json. So that way, when someone else clones our project from GitHub, they can run npm install, and npm install will look at Axios, we'll look at the package.json and the package-lock.json to install the packages that we need here in the node modules directory. And so node modules is where this stuff lives. You will never have to modify this directly. If you're curious, you can go inside and poke around in here, and Axios itself has a package.json that has a bunch of dependencies. And you'll never need to dig around inside here. But if we look at node modules, you know, we only installed Axios, but there are all these other libraries that got installed. And the reason is because these are dependencies of Axios. And so, for example, if I delete the node modules directory and I run npm install, npm will look at my package.json and more importantly, my package-lock.json file to install the dependencies. So what you always want to do with an npm project, and Vite will do this for us, is create a git ignore file and ignore node modules, because that's a lot of stuff to check into version control into GitHub. And also because I want to make sure I'm installing the most recent version of, or the desired version of these things. The versioning, there's a lot of options and flexibility that aren't worth going into here right now. So what is this package-lock.json file? So if we look at this, it starts to look a little bit like package.json, but then it very quickly gets different. You know, we see it's the name of our project and the version, but then there's all these things. And so each one of these is an NPM module or package that's been installed. And there's a version, there's a pointer to where to find it on the npm.js server. There's a hash to guarantee that we have the correct version. And then there are the dependencies of this dependency. So installing Axios, you know, was sort of like pulling on the thread because Axios had a couple dependencies and those had dependencies. And all of that is put in the package.json, the package-lock.json. So this is like the authoritative source of truth for all the dependencies, for all the things that we need to install our project. You never want to modify package-lock.json directly. It should always be generated by NPM, and NPM will update it. Package.json, you very rarely want to modify dependencies directly. Maybe if you installed something and forgot, but really you want to just make sure that when you run npm install, you know, whatever package I want to install, use --save, and that will make sure it gets added to the dependencies here into the package-lock.json file. So I just want to pause and catch up on questions. And let me catch up on our Whiskey Questions channel and see what's on people's minds. Nika, great question. Because there's so much in package-lock.json, is this considered bloat? It seems like a lot of stuff. It is absolutely a lot of stuff. It is not considered bloat because what this does is very explicitly identify every single dependency needed to make this project run. right? Package.json is a bit higher level where it says, hey, we installed Axios, but what does Axios need? And what do the dependencies of Axios need? Let's put all of that in one place and specify the specific version that we need and use a hash so that we can check that we're actually getting the correct version of these things. That said, the JavaScript, Node.js, NPM world is a little notorious for there being tons and tons of dependencies. So the ecosystem is a little nuts, and I think you are correctly picking up on that. But no, in and of itself, this is not bloat. And text files are tiny. The amount of space that a text file takes up relative to like installing all this stuff is much smaller. So having this checked into version control is totally fine. But this is not something that we ever want to modify ourselves. It should always be generated. And Nika, yeah, thinking of package.json as like a high level 10,000 foot view and the package.lock.json as like the detailed view is exactly it. It's like in package.json, we're saying, give me a Volkswagen Jetta, and the package lock says, give me a 2000 Jetta with this engine, and these are the tires, and this is when it was most recently serviced, and this is, the interior package, and it's like all the details. Does that help answer your question a bit?
Yes, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, great question. What other questions do folks have? I see someone is throwing one into our question channel. I'll wait a moment, Roger. I see you typing there. And then we'll dive in.
Natalie has a question about the get ignore just above that.
Oh, yeah, what's up?
So I just put in the whiskey chat or the whiskey questions. I said, so what exactly does the get ignore do? Because earlier you said that people who download our repo would be able to do like NPM install, and it would, install the dependencies. Does the
Yeah.
NPM or does the get ignore make that not happen anymore? Or
So remember what the .get ignore file does is it tells Git ignore this file or directory. Don't check it into version control. So like when I do, git add dot to add all the stuff in my project, it will add everything except the node modules directory. And again, the reason I don't want that is because it's like I don't want the actual code for all of these things. I want the dependency list in package.json and package.lock.json. And then when you clone my project and it has that package.json, you can just run npm install. And based on that, it will install things.
got it. Thank you.
Yes. And Roger, yes, npm, we use this to install whatever particular dependencies we need for the project. Tyler and Michael, and then I do want to keep on rolling.
My bad. That answered my question. I didn't realize I still may end up.
Awesome. Michael, yes, sir.
Oh, we're good. I basically had the same clarifying question. That's all. And also just a shout out because I'm glad that we're actually taking the time to do an in-depth understanding of NPM and everything and not just kind of a glaze over. So
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We're going to be living and breathing NPM and JavaScript for like the next week and a half of our lives. So this is the time to do it. So let's start writing some code and using NPM. We've seen some, can someone remind me why does NPM start run index.js for me?
Because you added the script to package.json?
Exactly. Right. If I make this go away, we'll just delete it for simplicity. And I do NPM start, then I get an error. And there are a couple names such as start and test that NPM makes a little easier, but we can add whatever script name we want. We just need to do then like NPM run boot to run that command. So let's talk about importing, right? Because that's, I think, where this stuff starts to get interesting. And we'll probably come back to the package.json in a minute, but being able to import stuff is one of the most important parts, right, of building bigger software projects. And we've talked a bit about Node.js and NPM, how to create an NPM project and installing dependencies. Let's look at importing. And there's one or two ins and outs there. But it's not that crazy. So we know, like, if this was Python, and let me just go ahead and show what I want to import. I have in a level up, actually, I do apologize. I have a JSON file with some tasks. So let's copy that into my project, and we're going to start just with importing some JSON. So I've got this JSON file, tasks.json, and I want to import it into my index.js so that we can do stuff with it. Right, and if this was Python, maybe we would just say import tasks, or from tasks, import task. But how can we do this in JavaScript? Any thoughts? And some of you may have seen this before, and many of you not, and that's why we're going over it now. Brian, yes, sir.
Is it the require?
Yes, that is totally one way that we can import stuff. So there are two ways to import things in JavaScript. The sort of older way is using this command require, and let's see what that looks like. And I'll talk about what it does, and then we'll learn the newer way that we'll be using for the rest of the course. So require, and if I go ahead and hover over this, oh, I actually don't get a great description. Require is a function that we get along with Node.js. It's part of the Node.js standard library, I believe. And we give it a path. You're probably going to usually want it to be a relative path. And since tasks.json is in the same directory here as index.js, I'm going to do tasks.json. What require actually does is require actually runs that file. So with JSON, there's no JavaScript code to run. So it will just return that array of tasks. Because if I look here in my JSON file, we see that tasks.json is an array of objects. And I'll put this here to make sure that this is running. And let's just then console log tasks. And I'm going to use npm start to run my script. And if we look here, we see that indeed all these tasks got printed out. So we can use require to import stuff. This is using what's called a common JS module, which is sort of an older way of doing it now. The one nice thing about it is we don't have to do any sort of configuration with our package.json for this to work. And if I had, and let's just make a file named foo.js and open it up here. And let's just say, I'm not even going to get into that much about how you export stuff with common JS modules. because we're not going to use them. I just want to kind of demonstrate sort of what it does. If I run my code now, and let's go ahead and comment this out so we don't see all of the tasks. So if we look down here at this little print statement, foo, that's because require actually runs the code in this JavaScript file. And that can be useful. And there's a special way to get stuff out of this. It's you use this special word, I think it's module.exports, and it's an object, and you can put stuff on it. But we're not going to be doing any of this. The backstory here is JavaScript is constantly evolving. So at one point, this was the only way to be like importing from different files and modules and stuff. And then a better system called ES modules or ES6 modules was created that gives us more flexibility and control. But for a long time, that was not universally supported and not universally supported on browsers, but now it pretty much is. So the old way is require. We should not have to do this very often. And I'll leave my console log hello. We'll put it down there and we'll just comment that out. Every now and then for like an NPM package you install, it might need you to do the common JS one. The newer way is a lot nicer and looks more similar to what we've seen in Python. We use an import statement. We'll see that there are ways that we can control what the name of this is, and it depends on certain things. But essentially, when we're importing stuff from a file that has one thing, it all gets put into this one thing, and we get to choose what the name of it is. And let's go ahead and run npm start. So I got an error here, unfortunately, and let's see what this error message says. So this error message is actually really useful, though it's a little hard to read. And note, we never got to my console log. The error happened, right? We run npm start, which runs index.js. The JavaScript engine gets to line 8. It tries to import. It throws this error. We never get to the console log. And we get a warning that says to load an ES module, we have to modify our package.json file and add a property named type and set it to module. There's also, you can use a different file extension, but we're not going to do that. And you're not going to want to do that. And then we have this error that's telling us the same thing. So this is the extra step that is involved with using the newer way. Again, the good news is Vite will do a lot of this work for us, but it's really useful to dig into this so you all are understanding how this works. And let's go ahead and put package.json there since that's what we're looking at. And let's go ahead and run npm start again. So now I got a different error. And this says error import assertion type missing. And right here in the type error, it says this JSON file needs an import attribute of type JSON. And this is a newer addition to ES6 modules to importing that is actually quite nice. And if we Googled this error, we would very quickly find a Stack Overflow post with a solution. Or if you ask ChatGPT and put it into the chat, it will undoubtedly have a solution. It will give you a solution very quickly. And what Node.js is telling us we have to do is we have to say, hey, we are importing a JSON file. And that's actually great because this gives us extra testing and logic. If for some reason tasks.json is not actually JSON, by adding this import statement, our program will throw an error, which is good because it tells us there's something wrong right off the bat, rather than like 100 lines later where we get an error and then we have to spend 2 hours digging to find the source of the problem, right? And you can't do this with require, with the old way. So this is one of the nice things about the newer way. Right now, there aren't a lot of different types. It's honestly just JSON. That is the only type. But this is nice to have. And if I run my code now, it works. And let's go ahead and print out those tasks just to confirm that we're getting what we expect. And we can see that all of our tasks are printing, and we're good to go. There is a warning here, experimental warning, importing JSON modules is an experimental feature and might change. You will get a lot of warnings with JavaScript and React and Vite. The JavaScript ecosystem is constantly changing. A warning is not an error. It does not mean something is wrong. Most of the time, you honestly just want to ignore the warnings, because it will just depend a lot on what is causing the warning. And most of the time it is something that we can ignore. So when you're looking at, print statements and logs and error messages and stuff, don't worry about warnings unless you know you have a specific reason why that one is relevant. Okay, so there is a lot more that we can do with importing, but I think I want to show the basics right now. I think what I will do is let me show you all how to import a function. So let's say I make a function, and this is going to be a very simple hello world for demonstration purposes. Let's see here what this squiggly is telling me. Declaration or statement expected. Yeah, there's a couple different ways to export stuff that are not worth going into right now. I just want to show, I think, the simplest and most robust way. And it's usually this, is you have to sort of follow this pattern of adding the const, and there's a couple other ways to do it, but this approach has the value of being simple and effective. And maybe we want to export const names, and maybe names is an array. And then when we import, we'll talk more about what this is later, but it's kind of like grabbing properties from an object. And so if I want to use the say hello function, I import it like that within my curly brackets. If I also want to use say goodbye, I can do it like that. Same thing with an array or an object or whatever it may be. And this is nice because it gives us more specificity and control over what we're importing and exporting. Right? And again, we cannot do that with require. And let's see, it looks like I do have an error here. And it's probably because, so this is I think the one gotcha, and they are hiding the solution to it in the error message. Did you mean to import say hello.js? It is very easy to forget the .js. That is actually important. So FYI, if you are importing stuff and everything looks fine and you get an error like this and you're not sure why, that's always a good thing to double check. And again, if you read through the error message, it'll be near the top of it. And I'm not passing in names here. So if we just do pass in some names, now we'll get hello Alice, goodbye Pop. And let me catch up on questions that folks may have in our questions channel. So just let me catch up on whiskey questions. And Jordan, yeah, I see your comment about export default. I don't want to open that door right now. There's a lot of different ways to be importing and exporting with ES6 modules. Landon, you were asking, do you need to remove the package.lock.json when reinstalling or NPM of a fresh project? And I see it looks like Tristan got to it. Yeah, so actually, you do raise a good point. Let's say for some reason, the package-lock.json got deleted. Let's say for some reason, node modules got deleted. All NPM needs is the dependencies in package.json. And it looks like I'm looking at the wrong package.json there. Or I apologize, it looks like I may have installed my dependencies in the wrong one at some point because I'm not seeing the dependency list where I thought it would be. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, we'll just run through this again real quick. Let's just reinstall Axios. Now let's delete package-lock.json. Let's delete node modules. So let's say for some reason I have an NPM project, package.lock.json is gone, node modules is gone. NPM install will look at package.json, look at that dependencies list. It sees Axios. It creates the package lock with all the other dependencies that are needed, and it creates the node modules and installs it. You really never should be touching package-lock.json, but if it's gone, it will be recreated when you run npm install, and it will look at the package.json dependencies.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. And Louis, great question about importing and importing specific functions. There are a lot of different ways to import with ES6 modules. It can honestly get a little confusing. Let's say I make a function, or let's make a constant some function, this does a lot of stuff. So you can export with the special keyword default. And if I do that, I can just do import some function from, and in fact, it auto-completed it for me. So you can in fact have a default export along with your other exports. They're called named exports. It can get a little confusing, and this way is simple and flexible, and it's why I wanted to demonstrate it first. But if there's like one thing that's the main thing you'll be exporting, you'll do it that way. And it will vary. Sometimes you'll have a bunch of stuff from a file you want to export. Sometimes it'll be just one thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Okay, I've been running on a bit, and I do want to make sure that we get to dig into some JS and then also have a bit of work time. So we dug into the import stuff pretty deep, which was good. As long as I'm demonstrating exporting, I might as well demonstrate how to do a named default export here. And let's say for some reason I want to do and this does all sorts of stuff. You can have a default export and named exports. Most of the time you will probably just have one thing. Most of the time it will probably be a default export. So don't worry about this too much right now. Once we get into React, you'll see there's like 1 or 2 patterns that we consistently follow. Why don't we take how does a 5, well, we're getting close to the hour. So why don't we actually let me see if folks have any other questions before we break. What's on people's minds? Okay, let's do this. It's almost 10 till. Let's just come back at the hour at 10 o'clock Central. And then we will take a look at some modern JavaScript language features with mapping and destructuring and filtering. Sound good? Awesome. Thank you, everyone, and see you all in 10 minutes. Okay. So we've talked about what is Node.js and NPM, how we can create a new NPM project with init. And can someone remind me, when I run NPM init, what does it do?
Installs the known modules and package-lock.json.
Close. NPM install. We'll look at package.json, and let me go ahead and open up package.json. NPM install, we'll look at package.json or package-lock.json to install dependencies. But all that NPM init does is create a brand new package.json file without any dependencies in it, right? Remember, right at the beginning of the class, I did NPM init and it prompted me for the name and the version and all these things I wanted. So that's all that NPM init does. And then if I want to install an NPM package, like let's say there's a datetime package. And in fact, let's go find a good one. It's probably not the most recent one, but maybe moment 4. Let's see if low dash. Oh, it would help if I was looking in the right place. So this is one of the popular NPM packages for dealing with dates. There were some great comments around security, by the way. On a practical level, if 21 million people are using this on a weekly basis, you can more or less trust it's secure. If I want to install Moment, how would I do that? How do I install any NPM package?
You just
NPM.
go npm install moment, right?
You
Yep.
have to do the save. You have to put save on there.
Yep. And so if I install Moment without save, let's see what happens. Oh, it actually added it. They must have updated the behavior. It actually got added to package.json without the --save. So forgive me. I would recommend throwing this -dash save on there. It might have some other side behavior that I'm not aware of. But npm installed moment, package.json has been updated. The actual moment package got installed in our node modules right here, and package.lock.json got updated. Now remind me again, like we've been writing all this code. Let me open that back up. To run it, I can run npm start, and can someone remind me why that works?
Because you have it written in the package.json file to run it to start to do the node index.js.
Yeah, and if I changed the name of that script to my thing, there is no script start in package.json. What I can do, npm run my thing. And we covered importing and exporting. And the important thing being to use the newer way with ES modules, and we import. And with JSON, we have to do it this one particular way. We'll see more about like importing functions and stuff later, but we got a taste of that, and that we give the path to the file, including the file extension. Let's work with this tasks JSON now that we've got it, right? I want to do some stuff with it. I want to loop through the tasks and print the task name and if it's completed. So there's a couple ways to do this. What's the way maybe that we're most familiar with to do this in JavaScript if I want to loop through an array? A for loop. Yeah, and Albert, can you talk me through writing that for loop? Because there's a couple different ways to do that in JavaScript, right?
Yeah, so we can start with for let I equal 0. So we can start at index 0, while I is less than the array dot length.
Yep.
And
And then
plus to increment.
Yep, I love it. And we can console log, and we can do, let's just print, let's say, let's do, how about task complete. And I'm pretty sure because of JavaScript being JavaScript, if we stick the Boolean here, we're going to see true or false. And I probably need to put a constant in that. And I think this looks pretty good. Let's run it and see how we do. I have a typo, which I did not do on purpose, but I ended my tag template literal here instead of there. And note that the error message actually told me right where the issue was with these two little caret arrows pointing to where I had it in the wrong spot. And there we go. And we've got each of our tasks and if it's complete or not.
So
sorry?
let's see now. They're gonna do.
What was that, Roger, or was that just like a hot mic?
Hot mic, sorry about that.
All good. No worries at all. What's another way that I can write a for loop in JavaScript to do this? Well, I can use, I think it's called a for of loop, which is a bit newer JavaScript language feature. And I think it looks like something like this. And I'm just going to print the task as a sanity check to make sure I have this right. I'm going to comment out that code. And let's go ahead and run this. And that does appear to be working. And so let's just copy this and put this there. Interesting. What did this not right here? Oh, I closed the terminal and it put me into the wrong directory. And I could tell that because just 30 seconds ago, I ran NPM start and it was just fine. So that kind of told me maybe it's not my code that's the issue here. So this is a newer JavaScript language feature. They both work perfectly fine. And a lot of the times I will just go with this approach because it's the one I'm so used to. But this is a good one to know, and it does simplify our logic a bit. We don't get the index, right? If we need a counter or an index for some reason. So there is another way to iterate or loop through an array in JavaScript as well. And it's called .map. And it's actually a function that every instance of an array object in JavaScript has. Objects in JavaScript are not like the object-oriented system is not nearly as rich as Python, and it works a different way under the hood. But on any array, I can call this method map. And in fact, VS Code is giving us a really nice description of it here. We have to pass it a callback function, sort of like we saw with promises. And for each element of the array, it passes that element into the callback, does something to it, and returns that element and constructs a new array. But what we can do with this right off the bat is we can use this to loop through our array. And it would look something like this. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this same line of code that we've been using so we can have it as a good reference. Just to see what map is doing. And it's going in order from left to right through the array. And it's printing out all of the things. So why would I want to use map instead of a for loop? And actually, does anyone know the answer to this one? Like what maybe are some differences or advantages of using .map?
I think it's something to do with like time space complexity, right? Like the efficiency of it.
Nope, that's a good thought, but not really. The big difference with map is that it returns a new array. It lets us transform each element in the old one. And let me show you what I mean. Let's say I want to, for each task, add a new property named, let's call it status message. And it's going to look something like this. Task.task, the description. And actually, let's just call this, we'll make it really long. Task.task, let's do const completed equals task completed. And can I maybe get a quick show of hands for whom the ternary structure with the question mark is a new bit of JavaScript? Just so I can get like a quick read on the class. Okay, awesome. We will be seeing it a lot more of it later. It is a really simple one-line if statement. Right? if I wanted to write out some conditional logic with like an if-else statement like we've seen, it would look something like this. This is called a ternary. You use it literally when you have like a really simple if statement like this that you maybe want to put on one line for readability. And it says, hey, look at the thing to the left of the question mark. If the Boolean value of that, if that evaluates to true, use this value. If it doesn't, if it's no, use that value. Right? And if you think about, say, maybe writing a little function, then it actually starts to make even more sense. Right? If I wrote a little function to figure out if the task was completed and return yes or no, it would look something like this. Because it's very common to need to do something like this, JavaScript gives us this little shorthand called a ternary that lets us do that. So I'm going to use this, and we're going to put it here. Most importantly, I'm going to return the object. And it looks like I may be missing. Yeah, we'll get rid of that. So what .map also does is it changes each thing in the array. It doesn't get rid of an element in the array. It doesn't add a new element in the array. It doesn't change the order of stuff in the array. It changes the one that we have. And it looks like I have a little bit of a typo here because I need to put a const in front of that variable type. And so now I have an array where each object has this status description message. And the best part is the original array is unmodified. .map creates a new array without modifying the old one. And it should be, at least, though I feel like I'm doing something wrong here. It should not be modifying the old one. I feel like I'm making a silly mistake that is escaping me at the moment. So one sec here, folks, while we fix this and see what's going on. If anyone does see it, please let me know, because I feel like it's something relatively straightforward that is escaping my eye right now. Let's change this to T just. Oh, and it's probably, I know what it is. This is getting into some JavaScript wonkiness that is not worth talking about at the moment. A better example of what I want to do is, let's do it like this. Yeah, I see what was causing that. It's a little more complicated, so I don't want to talk about it yet. So this is actually a better example. Where I'm going through the array of tasks and I'm turning each object into a string message, and that's what I'm going to return. And let's call this task messages. And so now if I run this, what we see is if I scroll way, way up, I created a new array, right? I mapped each element in tasks. I transformed it into something new, and I didn't modify the original one. And that, especially as we get into React, becomes really, really useful. And just to show one other example of this, let's say we had a list of numbers. And let's say for some reason we wanted to get a list of double numbers. Numbers.map and I can double each one. So that's really what map is designed to do. When you want to change each element in an array and you don't want to get rid of the original array, and as we see when we get into React, there are a bunch of reasons why you don't want to do that. And let me go ahead and comment these console logs out. But so we can see here's this original numbers array, and here are the double numbers. So I want to pause and check in and see what questions folks have, and let me catch up on our questions channel. DJ, there was a question about suppressing warning messages. I'm not sure if you can or not off the top of my head. Probably not. Nika, good question. Is map the same as in Python when we are doing a list or array transformation in place? Python does have a map function, but map actually is the opposite of in place, right? In place would mean we modified the original array. I know it got a little confusing with the task stuff, and that's because of how JavaScript objects work and certain things not worth getting into right now. But .map is sort of the opposite of modifying in place. We're creating a whole new array, and the original array is untouched. What other questions do folks have? Saul, yes, sir.
So because it's in an array, when you map something, it's always going to return an array, right? It's never going to be just a string.
Exactly. And not only is it always going to be an array, it's always going to be an array of the same length.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
great question. Great question. We're gonna see there's ways to get rid of things that we don't want, but yes, you'll always get an array of the same length. And if you think about like mapping, like each thing in the original array gets transformed and mapped into something in the new array. Chris, great question. In the numbers.map function, right here, is this variable num the element that's being ran through the provided function? Yes, that is exactly it. What map does is it takes each element and passes it as an argument to our arrow function. So as we go through numbers.map, can I run the debugger? I'm not familiar enough with the debugger. I apologize. Yeah, but let me go ahead and add a print statement, because that actually is probably that I am familiar with, and that is useful. So let me just console.log. And let's in fact just do like const doubled and let's go ahead and run this. So if I scroll up here and we ignore my hello world, when we get to this numbers.map, it's going through each element in the array, and each of those is being passed as an argument to this arrow function. Right, and like if I really wanted to, I could define the arrow function there and pass in the function definition, because the dot map takes a callback function. And sometimes you might do that, but most of the time for readability, and because this is sort of how the JavaScript code is written, you'll do it like this, where it's all in one spot. So this is an arrow function. This is the first argument, the first param, num, and map goes through this array and in order passes in each element. And we can see it printed out here, and then we double it and we see it printed. And then we return, whatever we return is what gets added into the new array. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, great question. Okay, let's play a bit more with objects and with mapping. So JavaScript objects, and let me go ahead and comment out all of this stuff so we don't have to worry about it at the moment. And let me go ahead and comment out this stuff. And let's just go ahead and well, let me in fact just I'm trying to think of what the best way to show this is. Let me just grab something from our list of tasks. And we can see down here that it prints out the object, right? And JavaScript objects have a key and a value. And I know that if I just want to see, the ID, I can do it like that, and it'll just print out the ID. I know that if I want to maybe see each of them separately, I can use dot notation to access each attribute or key on my JavaScript object. Right, as we can see down here. Now, there's a technique called destructuring, as in breaking the object apart into its keys and values. And we've sort of seen this in Python, that sometimes is easier to use than dot notation, and we will use it a lot as we get into React. And I'm just going to use Node for the moment to run this just for simplicity. Though I get really the same thing. So this looks a little weird, right? But what we're saying is here on the right side of the equal sign is an object. And on the left side, we're saying, I want you to grab the key from that object named ID and assign it to a variable named ID. It's the same as if we had done this. And because we're doing that so often, this sort of syntactic sugar technique called object destructuring has become a part of the JavaScript language and one that is used a lot. And it's not just here where we can use this to create variables. It's also when we're passing objects as arguments, like say to .map. Maybe we only want a list of the task IDs. So there's two ways to do that, right? I could do it like that, as we've learned with map. Let me go ahead and comment out those other console logs. Right, I'm mapping through the array of tasks and I'm just getting the IDs. With object destructuring, I can say, hey, whatever object is passed in as an argument, grab the key that's ID and assign it to a variable named ID. So that's destructuring, right? And maybe in fact, I want to get if it's completed or not. And maybe in fact, I want to make a new object that just has the ID and if it's completed. So that's called object destructuring. And it's going to pop up a lot. So I know it looks a little funny. You will get more practice doing it and using it. I think with object destructuring, I think that is really the main thing I want to point out. You can also do array destructuring, which can look a little weird. Like, let's say we had a function returns some array. And let's say we had it return just some sort of object, maybe. And for some reason, maybe we wanted to return a function as well. Well, I can do array destructuring too, right? Where and we'll kind of see over the next 2 days why array destructuring matters. You use it less, but it shows up in one very particular place. So more so, I just want to introduce the pattern to you all so it is less foreign. So we can see our array destructuring going on here. In fact, let me comment that out. Or we can see our arrays there. And if we wanted to, instead of doing all of that, we could do array destructuring. We're breaking apart the array and assigning the first and second elements of it to variables. And actually, I do want to pause and check in here and see what questions folks have. And let me take a look at the Whiskey channel. Natalie, great question. Is the return ID completed the new variable names we chose? That's a really good question. So when you're doing object destructuring, these do have to be the names of the keys on the object. For instance, let's go back up there just a moment and I will comment this stuff out. And we don't need to worry about that. If I change this to the task ID, and let's console log task IDs, let's watch what happens. Yeah, that's a great question. So we get an error. Well, and actually let me fix that error because that one is saying something else. So let's try that. So this is undefined. There's a couple things going on here. With the destructuring, what JavaScript does is it looks in an object for a property with this name. So this does have to be the same. Then if I wanted to maybe have like different different key names for the object I'm returning, like maybe I want to do this for some reason, I could totally do that, right? A lot of the times we just might want for the new object we're constructing, the key names to be the same. And because this is such a common thing, JavaScript gives us some syntactic sugar where if my key name is the same name as some variable, I can just do this. And JavaScript will figure out, hey, I want to create a key property named ID and give it the value of the ID variable. Will, yes, sir.
Yeah, can you use a for in loop if you don't know the key name?
You could, but you would probably never do that with .map because you'll be most of the time if you're like mapping through objects, you're going to know the shape of that object.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, it's a good question. If you needed to do like cleaning up or figuring that stuff out, you would want to do that like before you did the .map, probably. Yeah, good question. And then Nika, I saw you had a question about I think was that maybe about the array or let's see, what was that referring to? So I know probably over here. So let's bring this code back to life. And I think your question was, is this statement here on line 61, const ID equal to first task dot ID? What did I call first task again? Oh, Jordan, I see you answered it. Yes, thank you. I just wanted to grab an object from our tasks array. So first task is just the first object from that array. And thank you for answering that question in the chat, Jordan. What other questions do folks have? Okay, cool. I know today is a bit longer and we're probably not going to get a workshop in. But hopefully the breaks are helping. There's one more concept well, two more JavaScript things, and then we're going to take a look at React and Vite. And the last thing that I want to show related around mapping and all this stuff, well, there's really, I guess, two other things. So one thing I do want to show is when I'm writing an arrow function, and some of you may have seen this, if I only have like one statement inside there, I can use a syntax where I don't need the return statements. And this maybe looks a little funny. So let's use a simpler example here. Let's not worry about the destructuring. Let's just do task and task.id. And this is the same as if I had done this. So, and this is an arrow function thing. If you have an arrow function that only has one line, you can just omit the return statement and get rid of the curly brackets. And this becomes useful for stuff like this, because once you get comfortable with this, this is a very succinct, like efficient line of code to both write and read. So there's another really useful JavaScript function called filter. And this is about when we want to get rid of stuff. Like, let's say I want to look at only completed tasks. So just like .map, filter goes through an array in order from left to right, and it passes in each element as an argument to an arrow function. But the difference is it gets rid of things we don't want. So if task completed, return task. And here, and this is just because I need to move back into the to-do list directory. And it would help if maybe I console log this so we could see this in action. And let me go ahead and comment those lines out. And we'll put array destructuring way down there. So dot filter goes through and we tell it the elements from the array that we want to keep, and it builds a new array from those. So our tasks array is still untouched. Right, I can see all the tasks, but filter filters through it. And this is where it starts to get interesting. And if I wanted, you know, the uncompleted tasks, I would just do that. And it would help it again if we console log that. So this is, of course, now the uncompleted tasks. But this is where things start to get interesting and fun. What if I want completed task IDs? We use filter to get the completed tasks, and we use map to get the ID of that task. And for arrow functions, if there's only one argument, you don't need the parentheses around it, which can be a little confusing. And there's absolutely no harm in doing this to improve readability. And map and filter are really meant to be used together. Right? And maybe, in fact, what we want for completed tasks is maybe I want to return, you know, let's throw in some destructuring. And let's return an object that has the ID and the task description of each completed message. And then over here, oh, well, I'm so sorry, excuse me. We'll leave that as it is for the moment. Rather, over here, let's do our mapping, because maybe here what we want. And let me make sure that my code is right. I got that a little backwards, folks. I do apologize. Maybe we want our map to be a little more complex. Maybe what we want to do here is something like this. Right? I know these tasks are completed, so I don't care about that property of my object. Maybe I want to return a string message saying something like, or maybe return an object. And this is not message. Actually, to raise the point earlier, I have to have that be the same name as the object property, which is task. Right? And so now this is kind of useful because I've got completed tasks and I got rid of a property that I don't care about anymore. I'll just call this done. We'll call this just a different name, as I use the name completed tasks here already. Where this can start to get really interesting is we can use method chaining, which we saw a preview of actually in Weston's demo this morning. And I could do this. And let me write it, I think, this way so it's more familiar. And this is where JavaScript syntax can get a little confusing, because what I want to do is I want to call another method. So let's do a little simplifying here. For filter, in fact, I don't even need to return the task. I can just return a Boolean, and that is all that the filter needs to know if it should include this thing or not. So I can actually simplify this. to this. Because what filter does is we put the logic of if we want to keep it here or not. So, and I apologize for not mentioning this earlier. For filter, we just need to return a Boolean that says, do we want to keep this element in the list? And we can turn this into a one-line arrow function. Right? When you've got one line for an arrow function, you don't need a return statement. And so now if I want to call map on that and maybe do something like this, this is getting a bit more complex to read, but it's very compact, although it looks like I made a little mistake somewhere along the way here. So let's find out what that mistake was. Let's put the filter on this line and the dot map on this line, so it's a little easier to read. Let me comment out the dot map since that filter seems to be working just fine. And let's run npm start. And so I've got my finished tasks. The debugging technique I'm going to use here is simplifying. I'm going to write a really simple map function that all it does is just return the task unchanged because I want to make sure that that works. Now let's try maybe returning a new object with ID as task ID. And maybe we'll just call it task as task.task. And let's see if that works. And I'm getting a red squiggly there. And I think this is, in fact, where I went wrong because I want to return an object and JavaScript is getting a little confused about the syntax. And if we do this, it should work just fine. So let's try that. So we've just used method chaining and filter and map together to create a new object that just has our completed tasks. And we can do this in like very few lines of code. So this is, don't worry about like writing code like this and reading code like this right off the bat. But this is how a lot of like modern JavaScript with React is written. So this is where we are all gonna end up. But it all does the same thing. So it's perfectly appropriate to get here piece by piece. So I just want to check in and see what questions folks have. Nika, yes.
On line 96, because I think you had said earlier about when we're using arrow functions, if we only have one argument, would it be safe to assume we don't need the extra parentheses around task, or would it not work?
It would totally work. Yeah, and in fact, that's how I would write it. I was adding the extra parentheses more for readability.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, I know like this syntax can be confusing, especially with arrow functions, because there's like 3 different ways to write them. I recommend with arrow functions, write it out the full way with the extra parentheses and the curly bracket and the return statement until you get comfortable. If you have a one-liner where there's just the return statement, start there on like turning this into this. Like work on turning like one-line arrow functions into not having the return statement and the curly brackets, and if you need them, the parentheses. if the arrow function gets any more complex, write it out the other way, if that helps. What other questions do folks have? And so remember, dot filter returns an array. And then on that array, we can call dot map. And so all that this method chaining is some syntactic sugar in JavaScript to let us do that. To say, hey, filter, give us an array. And we say, hey, JavaScript, actually, before you're done, call this other function map on that array object. And so we sort of chain this like pipeline that our data moves through and we modify it. Natalie, yes. What's up?
For the dot filter, I don't really get how it knows what to return if you're, because you said after the fat arrow function, that's like your if statement. How does it know to return tasks without the return statement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me comment this line out and let's pop back to an earlier version of filter because I did actually break this down a little bit wrong, and I think that that will help. So what filter does is really the arrow function in filter returns a Boolean. And all this stuff is maybe a bit more complex, but this bit of the arrow function description is useful. It returns the element of array that meets a condition that we get to specify in our callback. So I get to say, if a task is completed, return true, and that tells filter, all right, I want to keep my completed tasks. And if we go ahead and console.log completed tasks, we can see that in action here. Right? If I wanted uncompleted tasks, probably actually the way to do it is we still need to return true because the filter needs to know what to keep, but we want to tell it to keep the ones that are not done. So we could keep the not completed tasks. So I just want to check in first of all to make sure that that behavior of the filter function makes sense, because I know I explained it a little differently the first time around, and that's kind of the foundation. Natalie, does that make sense? And do folks have questions around that part of filter?
No, that makes sense. If you're returning true there, why I would select that element from the array to make your new array.
Awesome. And so the next step here, because there's kind of like 3 links in this chain, is, and Michael, yes, sir, what's up?
I was just gonna say, so the logic is the way it's thinking is basically like, hey, this statement is true, return the true statement. Was that basically it?
This statement, go through each thing in this array.
Right, every element.
Figure out if the statement is true. If it is, add the thing to the new array. If it's not, get rid of it.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
Awesome. Yeah, good question. Yeah, it's a little funny because we return true or false, but it keeps the actual thing itself. And again, I apologize for the confusion there. And so then, Natalie, kind of like to add on to your question, the next couple steps were, if we look at this, hey, task.completed is already a Boolean. So I actually don't need any of this stuff. I can just do this. Because that's already the Boolean that says if the task is done or not. And that's what filter needs. And then because this arrow function just has the return statement on a single line, we can write it in a different way where I don't need the return and I don't need the curly brackets. And this is sort of special syntactic sugar to arrow functions, but this does the exact same thing. And this, I know, is a bit more foreign and confusing initially. The more you get comfortable to it, the more it's very succinct and readable. And so that's why we can write this way. And then over here, we can do that right here with the dot filter. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. There were a couple different steps in there, so I just wanted to walk through them. Okay, awesome. Let's take a 10-minute break. And then when we come back, we'll look a little bit at using Axios to make HTTP requests, and we'll be doing a little bit of method chaining. And then we'll have like the last 40 minutes or so of class to dig into React, which is really building on this project stuff and this JavaScript stuff that we've seen. Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Folks, thank you so much. I know we're covering a lot of ground today. Hopefully going into depth like this is helpful. Get away from the screen and I'll see you all in 10 minutes. All right. So know that today has been a big day and thank you for being patient with me. A lot of the good stuff with React and React projects we're going to get to in the last 45 minutes. A lot of this has been set up to make that process easier. The last thing I want to talk about a bit is this library called Axios. And I went ahead and I pulled it up here on their NPM JS site. And it's a library for making HTTP requests from the browser. And we're going to be using it instead of fetch. And if I look at it, I can see it's got 50 million weekly downloads, so I can tell it's extremely popular. If we go and we look on their GitHub, we can see there's very rich documentation. Installation, we can use NPM, which is great. And most importantly, when you install an NPM package, you're going to want to check and see how do they want you to use it. Because sometimes maybe there's an extra setup step. And so we're going to import it this way. We're going to be importing the Axios. It's really an object with a bunch of functions on it. You can think of it as very similar to a Python class in terms of how it's used, but it's a JavaScript object with properties, and some of those properties are functions. And we're importing it from, note that this is not a path to a file, right? This is the name of an NPM module. And so NPM will know to go to look in the node modules directory for this. We're not going to do require. And it's always good when you're installing and using a new NPM package for the first time to just take a glance at their quick start examples. And we can see that this looks quite similar to fetch. I can make a get request with promises and use .then to handle the response and .catch for the error. There's a .finally with promises that we can use if we want, that will always run. We can see here they have an example of how to use async await with Axios. And this is what we're going to code up in just a minute. And we see that this looks quite similar. We create an async function, and inside of it, we use await to tell JavaScript when it needs to wait for the HTTP request to come back from the internet with the data that we care about. So we don't, race ahead and print out a response that's empty. Then we have a try and catch block. And the reason that we're going to use Axios is it offers a lot more features than fetch. It uses promises by default and just has like richer features around promises. We're not going to see it now, but the more we get into it, we can add, they're called like interceptors, so that we can transform our response data when we get it or a request, and we can bake that in. So maybe every Axios request we make with Axios includes a cookie, for example. Axios is just offers more features, and it's compatible in both the browser and Node.js environments. Fetches originally for browsers and takes a little extra work to use in Node. And Axios provides much richer error handling. Not today, but later on, when we start using Axios to make post requests or delete requests, the fact that it has this function here, .post, to do a post request, makes it easier to use than fetch as well. And over here in the docs, we can see that it sort of breaks down Axios, and it has the API and all of these things. And what we are going to interact with is everyone's favorite API, which I believe we've all seen now, correct? The Pokemon API. Yeah. So, I can go ahead and I can hit submit. In fact, I'll just copy this to the clipboard. And at this point, I don't think we need, I think that's probably the bulk of what we need for, I'll leave this off to the side, but I don't think we're going to be using it very much. Right, I've got my URL. In fact, I could even use the command line program curl to make the GET request, the HTTP GET request. I could use Thunder client and so on and so forth. So let me open up index.js. And let's go ahead, and step one is to import Axios. And I've already gone ahead and done this. It's grayed out because we're not using it. Remember, you can tell. So what I do is imports from NPM modules, I put up top, and then often I'll like do a space and maybe add a comment just to say like local imports. And I think that's a simple and easy way to organize stuff. And you always want all your import statements at the top of the file. But I think JavaScript will actually throw an error if you have an import statement later down. So we've imported Axios. Let's go ahead and make use of it. And let's do a really simple Axios.get, and let's paste in this this Pokemon URL. And I'm just going to demonstrate this sort of promise style. So we're going to use .then with a response, and with this sort of single line arrow function style we've been learning, let's console log the response. And let's see if there's anything I have forgotten along the way or if this code runs. And there we go. We have a whole bunch of really nice data here on our Pokemon. If I look at the response, I see that there's all this stuff, status 200, status text, headers. And in fact, let's make this a bit bigger. Let's scroll down till we get to the good stuff, which isn't in config. Either it's not in request. Axios adds a whole bunch of stuff to this response object. I want to say the stuff we care about is response.data, which should have the HTTP response information. Let's see if that's correct. So response.data gives us the data sent back in the HTTP response. And let's actually maybe break down all these different bits. So I think I will turn this into a multi-line arrow function. And we've got response.data. I believe we also have response. Is it code? Let's see if response.code gives us anything. No, it does not down here with undefined. And response.data has so much stuff. We don't need to print out the whole thing. Excuse me, I lost track of where we were a little bit there. And so if we hover over Axios.get, or if we hover over the response object, we get some hints from VS Code. But I think I'm going to go back to the Axios docs real quick. And let's see what that says. And let's find here where they tell us about the response object. And here it is, response schema. The response for a request contains the following information. Data is the response that was provided by the server. Status is the HTTP status code. So that's actually what I was interested in. And let's go ahead and put that there. And I don't need all these terminals here. So let's make this a little easier for us to see. And over here in our Axios code, let's console log status. And as you can see, there's a lot of other information here as well. I apologize. I'm not sure why my VS Code jumped around there. Response headers, we probably don't care about. Config, we'll learn about later for requests. If we send something in the body of the request, we have access to it as well. Really, response.status and response.data are the big ones that are useful to know. Right, and now if I run npm start, I see right there, I've got my 200 response. And let's go ahead and add a dot catch if there's an error. And maybe here we just want to console log the error. And let's see what this looks like in Axios. And let's change this to something that we know is going to fail. Like that, right? That is not the name of any Pokemon that exists. And we get a huge object sent back again by Axios. And if we scroll up here, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here, but we can see like response.status, status text, again, the headers. So actually, it might make more sense to name this like, this is still a response, and we could do response.status. And if we console log response.status text, I believe this will show us the error message. And this is the HTTP response code, which will be an error code. So let's see if we have this correct. And it looks like not quite. I need to tweak this just a bit to get that right. And let's actually see if the Axios library can help me here. And let's see if I kind of search through the Axios docs for error. We find this nice here. When using catch or passing a rejection callback, the response will be available through the error object as explained in the handling errors section. So let's take a quick look over there and see what it says. So what Axios does is every response that's not a 200 range response, it treats as an error. The 300s, the 400s, anything like that, that's an error, and that's how Axios knows how to call .catch. And here we can actually see how to use this error stuff better. And I actually was sort of on the right track before. We should call this object error. We can name it whatever we want, but this makes way more sense. And in fact, the error object has a property named response. And there's response.data, response.status, and response.headers. And in fact, I will go ahead and copy this. Axios docs on error handling. So this is just to point out that, like, you know, when you're learning a new library for the first time, like stuff like this actually is there in the docs and is going to be really, really helpful. And how to go about finding it. And here we go. Now we're printing out a 404 and a not found, and we could print out a response.data as well for more information if we wanted. But I do want Ditto to work, so we're going to go ahead and just do that. So in a moment, we're going to see how to use Axios with async await, and it's going to be very similar and very friendly. I think maybe the only other error-related thing I want to point out, and I apologize that my VS Code keeps jumping around, is there is this very nifty little feature they offer here where we can use this function to JSON that gives us an object with more information about the HTTP error. Boy, I do forgive me. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Let's print that out and just see what that looks like, because that sounds kind of interesting and potentially useful. And we want to put this inside the error, and we're going to make Ditto fail. And so we get a pretty big object with all sorts of stuff, but it does have some useful things. A message, the kind of the error, a description, frankly, a whole lot of stuff here. So we might not need it, but that's good to know. And I want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions. And let me catch up also quickly on the whiskey questions, Jim. Okay, so that's Axios with promises. Let's take a look at using it with async await. And this will look similar to what we've already been doing. And I think what I'm going to do to help make this a little easier is I'm going to write a little function name, get Pokemon, and it's going to be an async function. And maybe it's going to take the Pokemon name as the argument. And now we can put our Axios code here, and we'll put it inside a try catch block, as we've seen. So we'll do try, and we'll do catch. And I know that I'm going to get a response. And I need to use await here because this is the asynchronous operation is making the HTTP request over the internet. And I'm going to go ahead and borrow the URL from above. And just paste that in. Except we want it to be a template literal, right? And we want this to be the Pokemon name that we care about. Let's see, what is it? Options? Yeah, so there's that should be wrapping. And I'm not going to worry about error checking or validation logic or anything like that because I just want to demonstrate Axios. So that's our response. And we know that we care about the response data, right? So let's just, in fact, do that. And let's just console log the data. And if there's a problem, we will console log, let's do error. And we can, maybe we just do error. We can use that to JSON that prints absolutely everything out. And in fact, I think I won't even do that. We can just put that information there, right? We could put whatever we want here in the catch. And now let's see if this works. Let me go ahead and run my get Pokemon function. And we're printing out an error. I didn't do this on purpose, but anyone tell me why are we getting an error here?
Because we need to add whichever Pokemon we want to look at.
Exactly. It's so easy. I got so wrapped up in the implementation, I forgot one of the most important bits. And now we are indeed getting ditto. So that's Axios, and hopefully a lot of that feels familiar. And as you get used to it, you'll find that it offers you a lot more useful stuff over Fetch. And I do recommend having the Axios docs open in a tab as you start using it and working on it. I just want to check in to see if folks have any Axios related questions before we actually start getting to Vite and React. Landon, yes, sir.
Could you talk to like it, or I guess is error within Axios, like it has properties, and is there a way to like rename it like a response? Like if you have like a whole like JavaScript file and you got a lot of different errors that are coming up, can you rename like if you scroll up to, let's see, where'd you have that? You might have.
You mean like right here in the catch where it's error
Yeah.
this? Yeah. You can name this whatever you want. You almost always you will see it named error or error, because remember that the naming this variable, it's created within the scope of this catch. So this specific variable named error does not exist outside of this catch statement. So that's how you avoid the kind of like name conflicts that you were mentioning. So on a practical level, you're almost always going to want to name it error, and you can just have a bunch of different error variables, and you would maybe use console logs and other things if you needed to specify stuff. And what you're going to want to work with really is what Axios gives you, because they give you this error object. On it, there's a property name response, and then there's all those different things that you can grab out as needed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was asking from the Axios docs that you put on air. That was, you were using dot catch up above. It seemed like you had to put air there and
Oh,
put something
I
else.
see. No, I just changed it because this is names are important so other programmers understand what's going on. This is not an object representing an HTTP response. What Axios is giving us here is the Axios error object. And that has a different shape than the Axios HTTP response object, right? So this would be confusing potentially to other programmers, and that's why I renamed it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Axios gives us on the error object, they give us the response. Yeah, there's a lot of like following convention, and naming is really about making it easy for other programmers to understand it. Michael, yes, sir.
Yeah, sorry, I think I got a little confused there. Is this kind of like yesterday when we did the fetch, where we're showing the difference between the former way of like writing it compared to the latter, which was with async, like we're doing here? I mean, here it looks like we're using try catch with both, but I wasn't sure, like, what, I guess, what's the difference between the line 45 and then the former one you were using beforehand? I guess
Yeah.
there's different ways of doing it, or is it just preference like yesterday, or what is that?
That's a great question. It boils down to preference. Under the hood, both of these actually work exactly the same. The try and the catch is sort of a separate thing. It's more so async and await versus promises with .then and .catch. You don't need try and catch with the promises because we have this .catch. Under the hood in JavaScript, async and await actually get turned into a promise with .then and .catch. Using async and await is a bit more of the modern style, and a lot of people find it easier, but it is preference, and they both do exactly the same thing. If you're not sure, I would recommend start out with async await and get as far as you can with that. And then if you find yourself wanting to switch, switch.
Okay, that's good. I actually prefer the latter one, the async and await. It seems a little bit cleaner, more my logic. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a lot of ways it is. That's kind of it is important to understand the .then and the .catch, because that's more directly kind of what a promise is and how it works, but that can come later. And that's exactly why async and await were created. We will be coming back to this stuff in just a bit. I think I will just leave kind of Axios up here off to the side for a moment as we get our React project going. Actually, I'll close this out and we'll bring it back when we're ready. Because now we start to get to some of the good stuff. So I know this has been a long lesson and a lot of prelude, but it's going to set us up to feel really comfortable as we create a project with React.js and with this build tool, Vite. So real quick, and actually, I guess I am going to bring back actually, I'm going to bring back a browser, because we're going to look at Facebook's React library very quickly and talk about what it is. So we'll put that there. Put that there. Talk about React. So what is React? It is a JavaScript library created by Facebook. We're designing user interfaces. The basic idea of React is you write a function. And we'll talk about all of this stuff later. And this is JavaScript. But inside this JavaScript, you can write stuff that looks an awful lot like HTML with these tags, which is called JSX, which honestly, I don't remember what it stands for, some sort of syntax. And when we run a program with NPM, it will turn this into more normal looking JavaScript that the browser understands. But this way, in my JavaScript, I can put all the stuff that I was putting in an HTML file, and I can mix that up with the logic of my application. And we use these functions that React called components. And it's not quite the same as like a class, but it bundles up a lot of this stuff. And so I can write a component that has code and markup together. And this markup syntax is called JSX. And we can add all sorts of interactive behavior. And React was created, React.js, because Facebook has Facebook, which you've all seen, and there's a lot of stuff happening on that site. So if you imagine using the tools that you learned over the last few days with JavaScript files and HTML pages and CSS pages, and you had to make Facebook or Google Maps this highly interactive application, it would be a huge, huge, huge pain to write it and to maintain it. So React was built to help make building really complex user interfaces like Facebook's easier, and also to improve the performance of them, because a whole lot of stuff is happening at once on the Facebook page, right? A new post pops up, 3 friends come online and their dots turn from red to green. Someone sends you a chat message, you like a post. That's a whole lot of JavaScript telling the DOM to do stuff. And it turns out that the DOM is kind of slow. So we'll learn that later, but React also can improve the performance of these complex web applications. And React gained popularity. Facebook open sourced it specifically so they could get other developers to use it and enjoy it and give feedback to improve it and make it a stronger product and sort of gain developer mindshare. And the better that React got from open source contributors, the more that Facebook can benefit from that. Google has something called Angular, that's their version of this. And it turns out that actually using React.js to make web apps and even like web pages that aren't super complex offers a lot of advantages and can be really enjoyable for developers. So that's a little bit of the story of React, and we'll learn more as we get into it, sort of about single page apps and other things like that. The trade-off is complexity. There is more complexity in setting up a React.js project. Facebook, in fact, created a whole library called, I'm so sorry, I'm still getting used to this. Facebook created a whole tool called Create React App to make it easier. We're going to be using what's called a front-end build tool called Vite. So there's something called Create React App that Facebook made, and then there's Vite, and there's a bunch of others as well. Because there's a lot of extra steps and complexity that happen with building React apps. So these tools help reduce that complexity. And if I go here to getting started, somewhere in here will be how to get started with React. I think if we go here and we click on React, it will maybe tell us how. And there's some instructions on scaffolding your first Vite project. We're going to run NPM. We're going to use this command, create Vite. And then we have to use a command, this -- template command, to tell it that we want to use React.js. Because Vite can be used for other front-end UI frameworks as well. But we're going to use it with React. So let's go ahead and do this. And in fact, let's open this one up just to make sure that I have this right. And I believe it will set it up for React by default. But I'm actually not certain, so let's run this and see. So first off, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make a new directory. And let's call it React Hello World. And I'm going to navigate into that directory. And inside here, I'm going to use NPM and this command create and Vite, and then dot. And the dot tells Vite scaffold up and create a new NPM project with Vite inside the directory where I currently am. And it will prompt me for a framework. And I will choose React. And we're just going to do plain old JavaScript. So if I wanted to, I could have done NPM create Vite without the dot. I could have done NPM create Vite, and I could have done template React, and I believe that would have skipped the manual step. But honestly, just doing and creating the directory yourself and then going inside it and doing npm create Vite dot, I think is the simplest. And let's see what has happened here before I run npm install. And I'm going to go ahead and open up a new VS Code with its Explorer bar centered to this window so we can just focus on our React project. And we can see what here. So that Vite command created a whole bunch of stuff. It created a README. It created a Vite config file. That's a JavaScript file. And there's not a lot happening in here. It created a git ignore that includes node modules and a bunch of other stuff. This is something for JavaScript linting that we'll get into later. Source is where all the code that we're going to write is going to go, particularly the JavaScript, and this is what we'll go through in a minute. Public is where things like certain image assets and like that go. But our step one here is to run npm install, because Vite also created a package.json with a whole bunch of stuff. And let's take a look at what it did. It named it for me. It already set the type to module, so we can use ES6 modules and import. It created a whole bunch of scripts, and these are really important. Most of the time, we're going to be using the dev one that will create a little server for us. And it added some dependencies. Dev dependencies are dependencies, but we tell package.json we only need this for testing. When you learn how to deploy the applications you build onto like AWS and the cloud, this is how we can tell it, hey, we don't need to install like the test library for like the version of our code that's running that people use. But you don't have to worry about this too much right now. If you want to install something as a dependency, like say there's some testing library, you would just do --save -dev for dev dependency. But note that there's no node modules directory, right? So none of these dependencies have been installed, and there's no package-lock.json. So it's going to take a minute. But now we have a node modules directory with all the stuff installed, and it constructed that package-lock.json. You don't want to modify the scripts that Vite has created. You don't want to delete stuff from here. You maybe will be adding new scripts of your own, but beyond that, you really shouldn't be touching the package.json directly, since npm install will add dependencies in here as needed. So let me go ahead and quickly exit full screen. Forgive me here. Because we'll get this stuff set up so we can see all the stuff that we want to see. And now we'll do our tiling. This, I have to admit, this does drive me a little mad that I can't get the URL bar up here. So we'll come back to that in just a moment when I get that set up. And thank you for being patient with me here. I'm still getting this other approach under my fingers. But the bit that I want to run, that's the interesting bit, is we're going to run this dev script. And that's kind of what Vite was telling us to do. And this runs a server for us on localhost 5173 or 5173. It should most of the time be on 5173, but if you have something else using that port, it will use a different one. And now that we have this up, we can go back to the other approach. So this is what I wanted to show. So we have a React.js app running, and let's see what we have here, right? Because this actually has given us a lot of stuff. I can see that there's a whole bunch of HTML, and I'm wondering, where did this come from? I can see that I've got an image asset here, and we have all these different CSS styles as well. If I go to my sources tab, I can poke around in here. Interestingly, if you go into the source directory, you can actually see the different files that get loaded. If I go to the network tab, I can see some network requests, but this is really here and the consoles where we're going to hang. There is a great Chrome extension called, I believe it's React DevTools, that I do like because it lets you kind of look at your React app. There's not a lot to see now, but as you get into this more, that can become quite useful. So the question is, where did all this stuff come from? Let's start looking at the source code of our project and seeing what lives where. So first off, there's an index.html here. And this is the only HTML file that gets loaded. And if I look at what's inside here, there's not a lot. There's a doc type. There's all the standard boilerplate. Okay, there is a link to vite.svg. And if I look inside the public directory, I see that's there. So I know where that comes from. I see that's where the title that we can't see right now because the tab is hidden because the full screen view is there. I see the head and the body and so on and so forth. The most important thing, but there's nothing else. There's all this other stuff, but nothing else. And this is what React does. Is that it? Sorry, I'm not used to the multiple layouts. There we go. React creates all of this HTML for us. So like all the interesting stuff happening is from this JavaScript file, main.jsx. And we'll look at that in just a minute. And so this command, npm run dev, it does two things. It does what's called transpiling the JavaScript to bundle it up into like one tiny file. And it starts a server and it sends the HTML page over to our browser. And our browser says, cool, all right, there's a script tag. It wants source/main.jsx. Let's go grab that file. What happens? Well, let's see what happens in main, and we'll talk about how the rest of this happens. Source, SRC is short for source, as in source code. And this is where almost all the code you write will live. You almost never will need to modify main.jsx. Vite has already imported React. There's a library, React DOM, as in document object model. And this is how React interacts with the DOM. It uses this model. It imports this other code from app.jsx, and it imports some CSS. And if we go in here, we can see a bunch of CSS, and we'll probably get rid of it all in a minute because it's boilerplate stuff that we don't want. But we can see that this React DOM library is being used to create a root. And we see something familiar here, document.getElement by ID. And the ID that we're looking for is root. And if I pop back to my index.html, lo and behold, there is an empty div here named root. And we see this command render. And inside here in this syntax that looks like an HTML tag, but it's not. This is our React component named app. And this is how you render a React component. And this strict mode stuff gives us some nice behavior that we want that makes life easier. But this is actually the most important piece. And what this does is this is sort of like our main method or our runner py. Index.html loads. It then gets the JavaScript from main.jsx that imports all these things. It finds the div with the ID root, and it uses that to build everything else on. And if we look at our HTML over here, notice that everything else is inside that div ID root. So once the JavaScript starts running, once React starts running in the browser, it builds all this stuff off of the root, and that's called mounting, right? We've mounted our React app onto this div with the ID root. And the interesting stuff is here inside app.jsx. And so let's just kind of continue this journey a bit and see where it goes. So there's an awful lot of stuff going on inside here. We'll learn later about use state, what's called a React hook. But I see that I'm importing a logo. Inside source, there's an assets directory, and this is where more CSS and another image asset live. And so this is the nice thing about NPM projects and ES6 modules and Vite and React. There's all this setup, but all of a sudden in my JavaScript code, which we have to use the file extension JSX when we're using this stuff, when what looks like HTML, which is called React elements that get turned into HTML. And then Vite has these other build tools not worth going into right now that do the work of turning this into normal JavaScript that the browser can read. And it's a whole topic not worth going into right now. But if we poke around in here, somewhere in here, and I apologize because they've changed this so many times, is the actual like JavaScript source code, which will look quite different. But here in app, now we start to see all of these things, right? Like here's the href to the Vite logo. Here's Vite plus React. Here's, I click on this button and it changes. And note that all of this stuff is inside the return statement. So a React component is just a function that returns stuff that gets rendered to the DOM. And what the Vite dev server does for us, which is great, is what's called hot reloading, which is when I change something and save my file. And maybe is it not running? Let's try this again. There we go. So if I change my code and save it, it automatically refreshes, which makes for a really great workflow. Right? Than having to like refresh all the time. So that's the Vite dev server. So there's a lot of magic happening here. So let's start breaking this down. Let's get rid of some of the things that we don't want. And the great thing is, so technically these are called React elements. It's not HTML, but you can see it's all the exact same tags. It's this thing called JSX that is part of React that has been created to make it really easy to write stuff that gets turned into HTML. And we'll learn more about components tomorrow, because as this sort of hints at, you can create a bunch of components that you can use inside here, but we'll see that later. So right now, let's just start by getting rid of stuff we don't need. I don't need that link. I don't need that link. The H1 is nice. This div is empty, so I don't need that anymore. We're going to learn more tomorrow about what's happening here with set count and use state. But the important thing here to note is the button on click. This looks familiar, right? So let's actually, so we're not using this, and we're not using this, and we're not going to use this, and we're not going to use this. But let's keep the button and the on click. And maybe we're just going to have it say hello world when I click the button, just so I know it's working. And note that we get these really useful error messages as I go. And I'm getting an unexpected token, expected a curly bracket, and it's pointing out exactly where it is on line 8 in my code. And if I look here, it does indeed look like I have an extra closing parentheses. And if I get rid of it, that solves the problem. Now, note that something is breaking, but we're not seeing anything. But if I go to the console, I get an error message. Uncaught reference error, count is not defined at app.jsx line 921. And if you click this, it'll actually show up in the sources tab, but I just recommend looking at here. So you always want the console open when you're working on React stuff, because there will be important error messages here that won't show up in other places. You also need the console here in DevTools. And we'll learn more about where this variable count came from tomorrow, but that is what's causing the problem because it doesn't exist. So let's just say this is the hello world button. And if I click on it in the console, I see hello world. So let's just keep getting rid of stuff we don't want. I don't want that. 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 These two, and it looks like I got rid of maybe one more thing than I needed. And let's see what it says the problem is. Unterminated JSX contents. I need to close this div because that div does not have a closing tag. So note these two guys right here and right here. These are called a fragment. If I look at my actual HTML, note that inside there, I don't see those. I just see the H1 and the div. But the way React works, what this returns all has to be within one element, right? If I did this, we're going to get an error. And the error says JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So if I wanted to, I could put these all in a div. And that will work just fine. However, now I have an extra div wrapping this stuff that I don't actually need. And as my app gets more complex, stuff like that starts to become more of a problem. So React created what they call a fragment for this specific case that lets you wrap this stuff without creating the extra div. And so this is kind of what I recommend doing when you need to. So the next thing we're going to do is we don't want this CSS. We're going to write our own. I'm just going to get rid of all of the stuff in the index.css. I'm going to get rid of all the stuff in app.css. And I recommend you write all your CSS in app.css. As you may have intuited, main.jsx you will rarely need to touch or modify. Its job is really just to mount the app. And this is the standard structure of every React project. Every React project you do will look this way with source and probably assets and then app.jsx and this main and this index. So this CSS does get applied to everything, but put most of the CSS you care about inside app.css. So now we have really simple code that we can do stuff with. And I know we're almost at time, and I want to just demonstrate one or two other things, and then we can take some questions and pause and kind of see where we are at. So, and actually, let me pause real quick here and see what questions people have, because we have covered a lot of ground. So I do want to check in to see what's on people's minds so that we can make sure that the rest of our time is useful. I see a couple questions in Whiskey questions, so let me just catch up there. I'm just going to go from the bottom up. Crystal, you absolutely can use Bootstrap with React, and later this week, either later this week or Monday, we'll be learning how to do that. Great question. Nika, you were saying that the render word reminds you of the Jinja 2 templating language with Flask. It doesn't make sense to think of React as a template language. And I would say you are very, very close. Rendering is all about turning something into something that's going to be visible. And we are absolutely rendering. And in fact, this return statement, what we say is this app component renders this stuff inside the return. And that's what gets put on the DOM. And I can put console logs here. I can say const x equals 5. And what I can do here is h2, the var x is, and inside these curly brackets, put my JavaScript. Very much like a template language, right? And maybe, in fact, I want to, x equals x plus 4. I can add any and all logic I want here, and it's complaining right now because I used const, but if I change that to let, we're good to go. So this is very much like a template language, but since we're actually using JavaScript, it's way more powerful. It's like a template language on steroids. It's like a framework for designing user interfaces. JSX is very much sort of a templating language that's part of this whole thing. I would say it's like a template language on steroids, because we'll see that React does more as well. But you're absolutely like in the right ballpark. There was a question earlier, I think, about when we want to add our own NPM scripts. Most of the time, you won't need to add NPM scripts to package.json. Every now and then, you might for like utility reasons or testing reasons, but it's not that common. I see a question from Michael about, I think, remind me and we can come back to that one later, about kind of package.json and how to organize stuff. But when I am developing, and this is where having two monitors is, if not necessary, very close to necessary, because I will always have a browser open and I will always have the console open. And even with elements open, you can also show the console as well, which I do recommend, because like you will see errors there and stuff. So you always want the console open and the browser open, and you also be able to need to see this, and you will be having more and more things to run, like eventually a backend server. So I often will split my terminal like this so I can see all my stuff. And then there was a question about Axios docs and async await. Great question about older browsers. Until maybe 2-3 years ago, there were some significant differences between what different browsers supported. Like a decade ago, it was way worse. These days, things have gotten pretty standardized and pretty good. And also part of the reason that React and all this crazy JavaScript stuff was created is because under the hood, what Vite is doing is adding a bunch of code to make sure that this code will work across all browsers. So that problem has been abstracted away for us. That's a great question. There's a site called like caniuse.com if anyone wants to check out like the terrible old history of the internet. What questions do folks have around React? Landon, yes, sir.
Could you go back to like your directory tree and kind of just say, okay, this
Yeah,
dot CSS affects this one, and this index affects this one, and this is how it's getting displayed?
yeah, absolutely. And in fact, let's go from the top with the whole thing here. So the website loads, right? And what it loads is the HTML file. It loads index.html. And this is where the Vite dev server that we run with that npm run dev command does some magic for us, because it does some, it's not worth going into right now, but it's called transpilation stuff to bundle up the JavaScript and the images and the CSS to where it needs to be. And it's a little web server serving index HTML. And there's not a lot in here, right? And we can see all this stuff here. And the browser loads index.html. Remember that everything here inside the div ID root doesn't exist yet when the HTML page is first loaded. The browser hits the script tag. It says, oh, there's some JavaScript. Let me grab that file, main.jsx. This is sent over to the server, to the browser, and this JavaScript is run inside the browser. The Vite dev server does the magic of sending the React JavaScript library and this JavaScript library and our import statements to the browser. That's a little more advanced than magical, but it all gets sent to the browser. So all the React.js code for this library, all the JS for this library, all this JS code that we write, and whatever we put in here is all sent to the browser. And if we want to, we could put something in here. I don't know. I admit my CSS is a bit rusty, right? But this index.css is loaded here and will affect everything. However, for practical reasons, it ends up easier putting the CSS in the app.css. And so I recommend not putting anything in index CSS unless you run into a specific reason why you need to. So the browser loads all this stuff. It then says, all right, React DOM library, let's call this function. Oh, this is some normal JavaScript. I know how to do this. Document.getElement by ID root. Oh, we call the render method. I should render this component. And this is the JSX syntax. And this is how we tell React, go find this function, run it, and turn whatever is returned here into HTML to be rendered to the browser. And so a React component is a function. So app is a function. It's normal to have one component per file, per simplicity, like we see here, and the file name is the same as the component name, and you should keep that convention. It will make your life easier. Whatever is inside the return statement is stuff that gets rendered to the DOM. So it's these elements, right? I can't, if I put like JavaScript logic in here, it needs to go inside the curly brackets or work just like it would with normal HTML. So this renders that component, and React DOM mounts all the stuff that gets rendered inside this div. And let me just pause right there, because those are some pretty big leaps right there, and I want to see if this helps Landon and if folks have questions around that.
That definitely helped. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. What other questions do folks have? Natalie, yes.
So even though the main.jsx has the link to the, I forgot what the others, oh, the index CSS, that doesn't even really matter because our app.jsx is being
Has-
rendered, which has the app.css.
Yeah.
So that's how it's
Yeah.
connected. Okay.
Exactly. And so like, for instance, in main.js, like I'll just re-add, let's do, I had, what was it? Body, background color, blue. Right. So if I get rid of this import statement, that CSS is not getting loaded and used in the browser now. Main.jsx, you're really not meant to put much stuff in here. Its job is really just to mount the app, which is called the root component, because just like HTML elements form a tree for the DOM, the React components form a tree. Like all of the components that we'll learn about how to make tomorrow are going to live inside app. And the job of main is just to mount the app. So that's why you don't want to put too much stuff here. That's why, like maybe certain global settings, you put in index CSS, but on a practical level, you put most of the stuff in app.css. If you really want to, you can create like separate CSS files for different components, but it's probably easiest for now to just put everything in app.css. So if for some reason, you know, let's say for all the H1 elements, maybe what is it? Is it text decoration color? Or I think it's just color, isn't it? To change the color of text.
Yeah, it's just color.
Thank you. So if I want to do stuff like this, I could just put it all in the app.css. And similarly, the reason that that works is because this import statement loads it in and sends it over to the browser. So if I got rid of this, then none of that would load. Does that help a bit?
Yeah, it was just confusing at first because there was multiple CSSs, but I think I get it now.
For sure. Totally. So the goal for today, I apologize because I didn't get into a lot of writing of code. Tomorrow we're really going to learn to leverage React. For today, for most of what you're doing, we actually want you to keep, and by the way, actually the one thing that's maybe that actually is good to point out is, let me these elements are almost the same as HTML. The one difference that is really significant is if this was HTML, this would just be class, right? But because class is sort of a special word in JavaScript, you have to name these class name. So if I have a card class that I want to make, then I have to assign it here. And maybe what I need to do here is it needs to be assigned here.
Isn't a class a period in CSS and not a hashtag? Or do I have that backwards?
No, you're absolutely right. My CSS is rusty, and that was the problem. Thank you so much. So hopefully we don't need this because it should apply to the children inside the div. Yeah. So that is the one important thing to note. That's a significant difference is you need to use class name instead of class for your JSX, right? And the goal for today is to really apply the techniques that you learned yesterday for doing front end stuff, but just inside this scaffolding. Tomorrow we will learn about components and React project structure and things like that. So like for today, you know, if we want to make, say, a guessing game, and I think maybe I will just code this up now, just so we can see it. Like maybe we want to make a guessing game where we can guess a random number. So in fact, I'll leave that stuff there for now. But, let's say I need to get a random number. And I'm not sure I'm going to go through this whole thing because I know we ran a bit long, but I think I just want to get a little bit going. And I'm going to get errors right now because I'm getting rid of things. So that is, I believe, actually from an extra parentheses. And let's maybe give our game a name. And let's use that here in the H1. And I do that by putting my variable. I can put any JavaScript I want inside curly brackets. And let's maybe write a function to guess a number to help us out. And this is going to get called maybe when the user like clicks a button or submits on a form. So we're still going to want to do prevent default. And maybe we need some user input. So I'm just gonna put that there. And let's grab that input. And actually, let's just console log this to make sure this is working. And let's have this button, when I click it, let's have this call my guess number function. And let's just see if, if I have the basics working here. So I'm almost there, but I probably need the value of that input. Since it's an input element, I think I can do that. So now I'm grabbing something. So I apologize because I would have liked to get a bit further along into this, but at least we can see, again, tomorrow we'll see how to do this the React way, and it will make more sense. But all of the things that we've already learned, you can apply and use, though from tomorrow onwards, we will never be interacting with the DOM like this directly again. But this is what React is doing. It's using get element by ID, and it's using the document create element to do all this stuff. So let me just show us the assignments for today, I think, and then we can wrap up because I know we ran a bit long. So I really appreciate that. And I'll stick around a bit to answer questions. And tomorrow I'll make sure we stay a bit more on track. So there's really 3 assignments here. The to-do list might be a good one to start with. The Pokemon one is using a lot of these tools that we've seen. I want you to create a React app, and this could be a good part of your day, just getting used to this. I want you to create a user interface, and it should just be a button that the user clicks to get Pokemon data. And try to maybe add some styles and layout, experiment with adding stuff to app.css. If you want to get fancy, to add a form or an input field and maybe like display some images. So again, using the things that you learned yesterday, but applying it in a React project. See if you can't do some filtering for the Pokemon and add some user interactivity. The to-do list app this is sort of the classic thing that everyone does to your first project with React. And so if you're not sure, this might be a good starting point. Again, don't worry about components and stuff like that. Just work on using the skills you learned yesterday to build interactive to-do list inside the app component. And then we do have some assigned reading. The last thing is I will recommend, if anyone does get through those, the React official tutorials are actually incredible, though it will go a bit beyond what we cover. Like if you finish that stuff and you want to get a jump on this, I would maybe just go through this first part of Learn React. But that's going to get way more ahead. So let me go ahead and stop the recording.